Before we begin, tell me in the comments how old you are, where you are from, and whether you are currently in a relationship or have your eye on someone special. You never know, your story might help someone else feel a little less alone. And one click on the subscribe button is the biggest motivation for me to keep bringing you more meaningful stories. The most expensive mistake I ever made started with a joke that cost absolutely nothing. At least that was what I believed when it happened. My name is Charlotte Bennett, and for most of my adult life, people assumed I had the answer to everything. As the CEO of one of the largest investment firms in New York, I spent my days making decisions that moved millions of dollars. Financial news networks invited me to speak. Investors trusted my judgment. Executives twice my age asked for my opinion. After 20 years in finance, confidence had become second nature. Maybe too much confidence. Every Thursday, I met with a small group of investors at an upscale restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. The food was excellent, the service was discreet, and the private dining room allowed us to discuss business without interruption. There was one waitress who always seemed to be working our section. Her name tag read Emma Sullivan. She looked to be around 30, with dark brown hair, calm eyes, and a quiet professionalism that blended into the background. She never inserted herself into conversations. She simply took orders, refilled coffee cups, and disappeared. I had probably seen her 100 times without truly noticing her. That afternoon, the discussion around the table became unusually heated. The market had been unpredictable for weeks. One investor insisted technology stocks were about to surge. Another argued the opposite. Charts appeared on tablets. Forecasts were debated. Everyone seemed determined to prove they were the smartest person in the room. Eventually, the conversation reached a standstill. Nobody agreed with anyone. Frustrated and slightly amused, I leaned back in my chair and glanced toward Emma as she arrived carrying a fresh pot of coffee. Maybe we should ask her, I said with a laugh. The room erupted in chuckles. Emma paused politely beside the table. One of the investors grinned. That is actually not a bad idea. More laughter followed. Feeling playful, I looked directly at her. All right, Emma. If you had $500,000 to invest right now, where would you put it? I expected an awkward smile. Maybe a nervous laugh. Instead, she set the coffee pot down carefully and looked at me for a moment. Her expression never changed. I would not invest it where everyone is looking, she said calmly. The room grew quieter. When fear and excitement reach the same level, most people stop thinking clearly. That is when overpriced assets become dangerous. Nobody laughed this time. Emma continued. The better question is not where money is moving today. The better question is where disciplined investors will quietly position themselves 18 months from now. I felt something shift inside the room. One investor slowly lowered his glass. Another stared at her in disbelief. Emma's voice remained steady. Most people spend too much time predicting headlines and not enough time studying behavior. Silence followed. Complete silence. For the first time in years, I found myself sitting at a table full of financial experts with absolutely nothing to say. And the strangest part was that I had the unsettling feeling she was only getting started. For several seconds, nobody at the table spoke. The silence felt almost unnatural. These were people who built careers on having opinions, yet every one of them seemed caught off guard by a waitress holding a coffee pot. Finally, one of the investors cleared his throat. That is an interesting answer. Emma simply nodded. Thank you. Another man leaned forward. What assets are you referring to specifically? I expected her to politely excuse herself. Instead, she answered. The exact asset matters less than the behavior surrounding it. Most bubbles begin when people become emotionally attached to being right. The investor blinked. And you think that is happening now? I think it always happens. Her voice remained calm. The names change. The industries change. Human behavior rarely does. I found myself staring at her. There was no arrogance in the way she spoke. No attempt to impress anyone. She sounded like someone discussing the weather. Simple. Obvious. Certain. One of the younger investors laughed nervously. You sound like you have spent time on Wall Street. For the first time, something unreadable crossed Emma's face. It disappeared almost immediately. I have spent time around people who believe money can solve every problem. The room grew quiet again. Then she picked up the coffee pot. Can I get anyone a refill? Just like that, the moment was over. She moved to the next table and continued working as if nothing unusual had happened. Around me, the conversation slowly restarted, but the energy had changed. Nobody was arguing anymore. Nobody seemed interested in proving how smart they were. A strange thought entered my mind. Had a Waitress just ended a debate that 6 experienced investors could not resolve? The rest of the lunch passed in a blur. People discussed quarterly reports and market forecasts, but my attention kept drifting toward Emma. Every time she appeared in the room, I caught myself watching. Not because of how she looked, because of the way she carried herself. There was an unusual confidence beneath her quiet demeanor, the kind that could not be faked. When the meeting finally ended, I remained seated while the others gathered their things. One investor stopped beside me. Interesting woman. Very, I admitted. Do you know anything about her? No, he shrugged. But I would like to. After everyone left, I found myself doing something completely out of character. I waited. 5 minutes later, Emma walked past carrying a tray of empty glasses. Excuse me, I said. She stopped. Yes. Up close, she seemed entirely unbothered by what had happened earlier. How long have you worked here? I asked. A hint of amusement appeared in her eyes. That is your first question? Should it not be? Most people ask where I learned finance. I hesitated. All right. Where did you learn finance? Her smile widened slightly. That is better. I laughed to spite myself. Well, a lot of places. That is not an answer. It is the only one I am giving today. Before I could ask another question, someone called her name from across the restaurant. She glanced toward the sound. I should get back to work. Then she turned and walked away. I watched her disappear through a doorway near the kitchen. The strange part was not that she had avoided my questions. The strange part was that I suddenly wanted the answers. By the time I stepped outside into the busy Manhattan afternoon, one realization had become impossible to ignore. I had gone into that restaurant expecting to forget a joke before dessert arrived. Instead, I left with a mystery I could not stop thinking about. Over the next several days, I discovered something deeply inconvenient. I could not stop thinking about Emma Sullivan. It was ridiculous. I managed investment portfolios worth billions of dollars. I negotiated complex deals. I advised companies larger than some small countries. Yet somehow, a waitress with a mysterious understanding of financial markets had become the most distracting part of my week. By Monday morning, I had convinced myself the curiosity would fade. It did not. During meetings, I caught myself replaying her answers. While reviewing market reports, I found myself wondering where she had learned to think the way she did. There was a difference between knowledge and understanding. Plenty of people memorized facts. Emma seemed to understand the forces underneath them. That was rare. Thursday finally arrived, and for the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to a lunch meeting. The realization alone should have concerned me. When I entered the restaurant, I immediately noticed Emma was not working the front section. Disappointment appeared faster than I expected. I pushed the feeling aside and joined the investors in the private dining room. The conversation centered on interest rates, inflation, and international markets. Normally, I would have dominated the discussion. Instead, part of my attention remained focused on the dining room outside. Nearly 40 minutes passed before I saw her. She emerged from a side hallway carrying a tray. For reasons I could not explain, relief washed over me. That was when I realized I had a problem. Halfway through lunch, one of the investors mentioned a technology company that had become the latest obsession among financial analysts. The stock had climbed rapidly. Every television expert seemed convinced it would continue rising. The room immediately filled with confident predictions. Then I noticed Emma delivering drinks nearby. An impulsive idea entered my mind. Emma, I called. She looked over. Several investors immediately smiled, remembering the previous week. One of them said. Round 2. A few people laughed. Emma approached the table with an expression that suggested she already knew what was happening. Yes, she asked. What do you think about Novatech? I asked. The room grew quiet. Emma glanced around the table. You want my opinion? I do. She considered the question for a moment. I think too many people are confusing popularity with value. One investor frowned. The company has excellent numbers. For now, Emma replied calmly. But when everyone expects perfection, even good results can disappoint. Another investor leaned forward. So you would not buy it? I did not say that. Then what are you saying? Emma smiled slightly. I am saying people become most vulnerable when they stop asking what could go wrong. The room fell silent again. I felt the same sensation I had experienced the week before. The feeling that everyone else was operating on the surface while Emma somehow saw deeper. Then she excused herself and returned to work. The discussion eventually moved on, but her words stayed with me. 3 days later, Novatech released earnings. The results were strong. Not extraordinary. Just strong. The stock dropped nearly 20% in a single afternoon because investors had expected something impossible. I stared at the market data on my office screen and slowly leaned back in my chair. Emma had been right. Not vaguely right. Precisely right. My phone immediately began filling with messages from investors reacting to the sudden collapse. Yet I barely paid attention. Instead, I found myself thinking about a woman carrying coffee cups in a Manhattan restaurant. Who is she really? Because the more I learned, the less sense her life seemed to make. And for the first time, I seriously considered finding out. The following week, curiosity finally defeated restraint. I told myself I simply wanted answers. That was the official explanation. The truth was less convincing. I wanted to understand Emma. Every new detail seemed to raise 3 additional questions, and my inability to solve the puzzle was becoming increasingly frustrating. On Tuesday evening, after another long day at the office, I returned to the restaurant outside of my usual schedule. The dinner crowd had already arrived. Soft music drifted through the dining room. Glasses clinked. Conversations blended into a low hum. For the first time since I started coming there, I was not meeting investors or clients. I was there because of a waitress. The realization felt absurd. I spotted Emma near the far side of the room speaking with an elderly couple. She smiled warmly as she helped them with the menu. There was something different about seeing her outside the context of my business lunches. She seemed relaxed, comfortable, almost as if the restaurant belonged to a completely different version of her life. When she finally noticed me, surprise briefly crossed her face. "You're here on a Tuesday." Apparently. A faint smile appeared. "Table for one? Is that allowed?" "I will have to check with management." I laughed. "I appreciate your flexibility." She guided me to a small table near the windows. As she handed me a menu, I decided to stop pretending. "I have a question." "Only one. For now." Her smile widened. "That sounds dangerous. You predicted the Novatech correction almost perfectly. I predicted investor behavior, which turned out to be the same thing." Emma shrugged. "Sometimes." I studied her for a moment. "Why are you working here?" There it was. The question I had wanted to ask for weeks. She did not seem offended. If anything, she looked amused. "You really do not give up, do you?" "Not when something does not make sense." "And I do not make sense?" No, the answer came out faster than I intended. Emma laughed softly. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me this month." Before I could respond, another server called her name from across the room. "Duty calls," she said. "You cannot escape forever. Watch me." Then she disappeared into the crowd. I spent the next hour eating a meal I barely tasted. Every time Emma crossed the dining room, I found myself observing her. Not in the way people often assume. It was not about appearance. It was about presence. She listened carefully. She remembered details about regular customers. She moved through the room with an unusual level of awareness. Nothing seemed accidental. Nothing seemed careless. By the time I left, I had learned absolutely nothing useful, which only made the mystery worse. 2 days later, the answer arrived from a completely unexpected direction. I was attending a private fundraising event hosted by several financial executives. The room was filled with familiar faces from the investment world. Near the end of the evening, I found myself speaking with an older portfolio manager named Richard Calloway. He had spent decades on Wall Street and seemed to know everyone. During the conversation, I casually mentioned Emma's name. The reaction was immediate. Richard froze. Emma Sullivan? Yes. The Emma Sullivan? My pulse quickened. I was not aware there was more than one. Richard stared at me for several seconds. Charlotte, 10 years ago, that woman was considered one of the brightest young analysts in the industry. I felt the room disappear around me. What? She was a rising star. Every major firm wanted her. My mind raced. Then why is she working in a restaurant? Richard slowly shook his head. That is the question nobody ever figured out. He took a sip of his drink before adding one final sentence. One day, she simply walked away from everything. And for the first time since meeting Emma Sullivan, I realized the mystery was far bigger than I had imagined. For the next several days, Richard Calloway's words refused to leave my mind. One of the brightest young analysts in the industry. Every major firm wanted her. Then she walked away. The story made no sense. In finance, people did not abandon opportunities like that. They fought for them. They sacrificed relationships, sleep, and sometimes their health chasing them. Yet Emma had apparently stepped away voluntarily. The more I thought about it, the more fascinated I became. On Thursday, I returned to the restaurant again. By now the staff had stopped looking surprised when I appeared outside my normal schedule. Emma was arranging silverware near the front of the dining room when she noticed me. "You are becoming a regular," she said. That sounds dangerously close to a compliment. Do not get carried away. I smiled and took a seat. This time the restaurant was quiet. The lunch rush had not started yet. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft reflections across the polished tables. For once, Emma seemed less busy. After bringing coffee to my table, she remained standing nearby. "You look like someone who has been thinking too much," she observed. "That is because I have." "About the market?" "About you." The words slipped out before I could stop them. For the first time since I met her, Emma looked genuinely surprised. I immediately felt ridiculous. That sounded stranger than I intended. A small smile appeared. Did it? I rubbed my forehead. "Someone told me you used to work in finance." The smile disappeared. Not completely. Just enough for me to notice. People say a lot of things. Richard Calloway specifically. Emma looked out the window for a moment. "Then he probably told you the flattering version. He said you were one of the brightest analysts on Wall Street." She laughed softly. "That definitely sounds like Richard." Was he wrong? For several seconds, she did not answer. Then she sat down across from me. It was the first time I had ever seen her stop moving during a shift. "No," she said quietly. "He was not wrong." I felt a strange sense of satisfaction hearing her finally admit it. "Then why leave?" Her eyes dropped toward the coffee cup resting between us. "Because eventually I realized I was very good at something that was making me unhappy." The answer caught me off guard. "Finance made you unhappy?" "Not finance." She shook her head. "The environment." There was no bitterness in her voice. Only honesty. I spent years chasing success because everyone around me defined success the same way. Bigger bonuses. Bigger titles. Bigger offices. She smiled sadly. One day I woke up and realized I had achieved goals I never actually wanted. I found myself completely silent. Emma continued. "So I left." Just like that. "Not exactly." A shadow crossed her expression. "Some decisions take years before they happen in a single moment." Before I could ask what that meant, someone called her name from the kitchen. The expression vanished instantly. She stood and picked up her order pad. "Duty calls again." "Emma." She paused. "Yes." I think that might be the most honest answer anyone has given me in a very long time. Her eyes met mine. Something warm passed between us. "Maybe that is because you finally asked the right question." Then she walked away, leaving me alone with a realization that felt impossible to ignore. For the first time, I was no longer interested in Emma because of her intelligence. I was interested because I wanted to understand the person behind it. The conversation stayed with me for days. Not because Emma had revealed some dramatic secret. Quite the opposite. There was something strangely powerful about the simplicity of her answer. She had walked away from a life most people would spend decades trying to build because it was not making her happy. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. My entire career had been built on the assumption that success and fulfillment naturally traveled together. Emma was living proof that they did not. Over the next few weeks, a new routine quietly formed between us. I still visited the restaurant every Thursday, but soon Thursdays stopped feeling sufficient. Sometimes I stopped by for coffee before work. Sometimes I appeared near closing time and ordered dessert I did not really want. At first, I told myself I was gathering information. Eventually, even I stopped believing that explanation. One rainy evening, I arrived just before the dinner rush. The restaurant windows glowed warmly against the gray Manhattan streets. Emma was organizing receipts behind the host's stand when she saw me. "Let me guess," she said. "You have another question." "Maybe. About economics?" "Not tonight." She looked genuinely curious. "That is new." A few minutes later, she joined me during her break. We sat near the window watching pedestrians hurry beneath umbrellas. For the first time since we met, neither of us talked about finance. Instead, we talked about books. Then travel. Then childhood memories. The conversation flowed with an ease that surprised me. Hours seemed to disappear whenever she was around. "What about you?" she asked at one point. "What about me?" "You ask a lot of questions." "Occupational hazard." "Fine." She smiled. "Why finance?" The answer should have been easy. I had answered versions of that question in interviews for years. Yet sitting across from Emma, the rehearsed response felt meaningless. "I was good at it," I finally said. "That cannot be the whole reason." I laughed softly. "You are becoming difficult." I learned from experts. The comment made me smile. After a moment, I admitted the truth. I liked certainty. Numbers felt predictable. Life did not. Emma nodded thoughtfully. "And did you find what you were looking for?" The question lingered between us. Outside, rain traced thin lines across the glass. "Sometimes," I said. "Other times I am not so sure." Her expression softened. "That sounds more honest than most executive interviews." I found myself laughing again. Lately she seemed capable of doing that effortlessly. As the weeks passed, those conversations became the highlight of my schedule. We debated ideas, shared stories, challenged each other's assumptions. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing Emma as a mystery that needed solving. Instead, she became someone whose company I genuinely enjoyed. Then one evening, something happened that forced me to confront a truth I had been carefully avoiding. I arrived at the restaurant and immediately noticed Emma sitting at a table near the back. She was not alone. Across from her sat a woman around her age. They were laughing together. Comfortable. Familiar. Whatever they were discussing clearly mattered. An unexpected feeling settled in my chest. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to identify it. The realization came quickly and uncomfortably. I was jealous. The thought was absurd. Emma and I were friends. At least that was what I kept telling myself. Yet watching someone else hold her attention felt strangely disappointing. Before I could decide what to do, Emma looked up and spotted me. Her smile appeared instantly. Bright. Genuine. For reasons I could not explain, that simple smile made the uncomfortable feeling even stronger. Because in that moment, I realized my curiosity had become admiration. My admiration had become attachment. And attachment was beginning to turn into something far more dangerous. For the rest of that evening, I did my best to behave normally. Unfortunately, I had always been a terrible actress. The woman sitting with Emma eventually left, and a few minutes later Emma joined me at my usual table. "You look concerned," she said. "Do I?" "You have spent the last 10 minutes stirring coffee you are not drinking." I glanced down at the cup and realized she was right. Occupational stress. That is not your answer for everything anymore. The observation caught me off guard. Emma seemed to notice. "Who is she?" I asked before I could stop myself. A smile immediately appeared on her face. "Who?" "The woman you were having dinner with." Emma leaned back slightly. That sounded suspiciously personal. It was a question. It sounded more like curiosity. Curiosity is how questions happen. Her smile widened. You really want to know? I hated how much I wanted the answer. Maybe. Her name is Rachel. Emma paused deliberately. We have been friends for years. Relief arrived so quickly that I nearly laughed. Unfortunately, Emma noticed that too. Interesting reaction. I do not know what you mean. Sure. She picked up her coffee. Whatever helps you sleep at night. The conversation moved on, but the exchange stayed with me. More importantly, my reaction stayed with me. I had spent weeks pretending my feelings were simple admiration, respect, friendship. Yet the relief I felt hearing Rachel was only a friend shattered that illusion completely. The truth became impossible to ignore. I cared about Emma far more than I should. A few days later, I finally acted on an idea that had been forming in my mind for weeks. I invited Emma to lunch. Not at the restaurant. Somewhere else. Somewhere neither of us worked. Are you asking me out? She asked after reading my message. I nearly dropped my phone. I am asking you to lunch. That is not technically a denial. My pulse immediately accelerated. Emma, relax. I could practically hear the smile in her voice. Lunch sounds nice. Saturday arrived bright and unusually warm for early spring. We met at a small cafe overlooking the Hudson River. For the first time, neither of us was surrounded by investors, customers, or coworkers. There were no interruptions, no schedules, no reasons to leave. We spent nearly 3 hours talking about childhood dreams, family expectations, regrets, success, failure. At one point, Emma told me about the final months before she left finance. I kept telling myself I was almost happy, she said quietly. That is a dangerous phrase. Why? Because almost can last for years. I stared at the river beyond the window. You know, most people would consider your career a dream. Most people considered yours a dream too. I looked back at her. And sometimes dreams belong to other people. The simplicity of the statement hit harder than any financial lesson she had ever shared. Later, as we walked along the waterfront, the conversation became lighter. We laughed more, teased each other. For the first time in a very long while, I forgot about markets, forecasts, and quarterly reports entirely. I was simply enjoying being with someone. As the afternoon sun reflected across the water, Emma stopped walking and looked at me. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you really keep coming back to the restaurant? My heart immediately betrayed me. Because I knew the answer. Because I had known it for weeks. I just had not been brave enough to say it aloud. And standing there beside the river with Emma watching me patiently, I realized I was running out of reasons to keep pretending. Emma's question followed me for the rest of the weekend. Why did you really keep coming back to the restaurant? The honest answer sat in my mind long after we said goodbye beside the river. I came back because of you. The problem was that honesty had suddenly become terrifying. For years, I had built a life around confidence. I knew how to negotiate. I knew how to lead. I knew how to make difficult decisions under pressure. Yet the thought of telling one woman how much she had come to matter to me felt impossible. The following week became a blur of meetings and deadlines. Unfortunately, work was no longer the distraction it once had been. Every accomplishment felt strangely incomplete if I could not tell Emma about it afterward. Every frustrating day felt easier when I knew I would eventually see her. Somewhere along the way, she had become part of the rhythm of my life. Then everything changed on a Wednesday afternoon. I arrived at the restaurant expecting an ordinary lunch. Instead, I immediately noticed something was different. Emma looked distracted. Not unhappy, just thoughtful. The moment she approached my table, I sensed it. Everything okay? I asked. She smiled, but it did not quite reach her eyes. Mostly. The word instantly caught my attention. That does not sound reassuring. She sat down across from me during a quiet moment between tables. For several seconds, she stared at her coffee cup. Then she took a slow breath. I received an offer. My stomach tightened. An offer. A position in Seattle. The restaurant seemed to fade into the background. Seattle. She nodded. A nonprofit financial education organization. I immediately remembered the passion in her voice whenever she talked about helping people understand money beyond profits and market trends. The role sounded perfect for her. Which was exactly the problem. That sounds important, I said carefully. It is. When would you leave? 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I repeated the words silently. 14 days. Suddenly, every future conversation I had taken for granted felt fragile. You are going to accept it? Emma looked out the window. I think so. The answer landed harder than I expected. For the remainder of lunch, I struggled to focus. Emma continued talking about the organization and the work they hoped to accomplish, but part of me was frozen on those 2 words. 2 weeks. Later that night, I sat alone in my apartment overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Normally, the view brought comfort. That evening it felt strangely empty. I kept replaying every conversation Emma and I had shared over the past months. The jokes, the debates, the quiet moments, the way she challenged me without ever trying to impress me, the way she seemed to understand things I never said aloud. By midnight, a realization finally became unavoidable. This was not about friendship anymore. If Emma moved across the country, I would miss her in ways that had nothing to do with conversation. I would miss her presence, her voice, her perspective, her smile. I would miss her. The next evening, I returned to the restaurant. Emma was closing out receipts near the front desk. When she saw me, she smiled warmly. The familiar sight only made everything harder. You look serious, she said. I am serious. Her expression softened immediately. What happened? I looked at her for a long moment. You happened. The words escaped before I could stop them. Surprise flashed across her face. Neither of us spoke. Around us, the restaurant continued operating normally. Customers talked. Plates moved through the dining room. Life went on. Yet somehow the space between us felt completely still. Emma's eyes searched mine. Charlotte, she said quietly. And for the first time since meeting her, I realized I had reached the point where silence was no longer protecting me. It was only delaying the truth. Emma's voice was quiet, but it carried enough emotion to stop every thought in my head. Charlotte, she repeated. For a moment, neither of us moved. The restaurant continued around us, but it felt distant, like background noise fading beyond a closed door. I took a slow breath. For months, I had been avoiding this moment. I had hidden behind questions, curiosity, admiration, and friendship because all of those things felt safer than the truth. The truth required vulnerability. The truth required risk. And despite everything I had accomplished in my life, risk suddenly felt terrifying. I did not plan to say that, I admitted. Emma's expression softened. I know. I laughed nervously. That obvious? A little. Her smile was gentle, not teasing. You look like someone who is trying very hard to stay composed. I usually am composed. Not tonight. For some reason, hearing that made it easier to continue. When I first met you, I thought you were just a waitress. Emma raised an eyebrow. Just a waitress? You know what I mean. I do. I shook my head and smiled. Then you answered a question nobody expected you to answer. After that, I told myself I was curious about your intelligence. Then I discovered your past, and I told myself I admired your courage. Then we became friends, and I told myself I simply enjoyed our conversations. I looked directly into her eyes. I was wrong about all of it. Silence settled between us. What were you wrong about? She asked softly. Because none of those things were the real reason I kept coming back. Her gaze never left mine. Then what was the reason? My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my chest. You. The word hung between us. Simple. Honest. Impossible to take back. Emma looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. There was emotion there now, visible and unguarded. Charlotte. I know the timing is terrible. I laughed once. Actually, everything about this is terrible. You are leaving in less than 2 weeks. I should have said something sooner. I should have figured it out sooner. You figured it out eventually. That does not help if you move to Seattle. For a second, Emma looked genuinely surprised. Then she smiled. You really do not want me to go? No, the answer came instantly. I do not. She studied me for a long moment. Can I tell you something? Anything. The reason I kept agreeing to coffee, lunches, and long conversations was not because I was bored. Hope flickered inside me. No, she shook her head. The reason I stayed after my shifts. The reason I answered all your questions. The reason I looked forward to seeing your name on my phone. Her smile grew warmer. Was you. I closed my eyes briefly, almost laughing from relief. Months of uncertainty seemed to dissolve in a single moment. That would have been useful information a few weeks ago. Emma laughed softly. You were not exactly sending clear signals either. Fair point. We stood there smiling at each other, neither quite believing how much had changed since that first conversation. Finally, I asked the question that still mattered most. What about Seattle? Emma glanced toward the window before looking back at me. I have not accepted the offer yet. You have not? No, why? Her answer came without hesitation. Because there was something here I was not ready to leave behind. The warmth in her eyes made the meaning perfectly clear. Months later, people still asked me about investment strategies, market forecasts, and career advice. But the smartest decision I ever made had nothing to do with finance. It was listening when everyone else laughed. Because a single conversation changed my life. And sometimes the greatest opportunities arrive disguised as people rather than investments. If this story touched your heart, comment the number 8.